You aren't disrespected. You just haven't taught anyone there are consequences for it. That sounds harsh, doesn't it? But think about it carefully. Every time someone crosses your boundaries and you let it slide, you are teaching them something. It's okay to push even further, and they will. Not just once, but over and over again, until you realize you're no longer respected. It's not because you are weak. It's because you never made anyone stop. Imagine this. You're in a meeting. You've carefully prepared what you want to say, and you know your point truly has value. You begin to speak, but before you can finish your thought, someone else cuts in, as if they didn't even notice you were talking. No apology. They don't even look at you. They just continue with their own story, completely naturally. And the hardest part is, no one else in the room reacts at all. So you stop. You offer a small smile to keep the peace. You tell yourself, it's okay. We can talk later. But then you never bring it up again. The conversation moves on. Everyone's attention is on the person who interrupted. And you just fade out of the conversation. And no one really notices. That moment, it's so small, almost insignificant. But in everyone's mind, a silent judgment has just been formed. This person can be pushed around. And from that one tiny moment, the way they treat you begins to change. You think they look down on you because they're disrespectful, or because they're just not a good person. You comfort yourself by saying, I'm just being the kinder one. But the truth isn't that pleasant. Most people don't wake up every morning with the intention of disrespecting someone. They are simply reacting to the very subtle signals that you give off in your daily interactions. Those signals aren't spoken in loud words. Instead, it's in the very small moments. When you get interrupted and you choose to stop instead of finishing your thought. When you aren't being listened to and you convince yourself that it doesn't matter. When you feel uncomfortable but you act pleasant just to avoid a confrontation. One instance at a time. So small, so hard to even notice. But the other person's brain, it registers everything. They begin to understand something, not with logic, but with a feeling. This person will not set clear boundaries. And once someone realizes that, they don't need to intentionally hurt you. They simply take one more step and then another, until the way they treat you becomes a habit. Not because they are a bad person, but because you never gave them a reason to stop and think again. There's a psychological mechanism that's very raw, but incredibly true. Human beings don't just communicate with words. They communicate by testing each other's reactions. No one would ever openly admit this, but almost everyone does it unconsciously. Even in the smallest interactions, the human mind is always asking a question. How far will this person let me go? They don't test this consciously. They do it through very simple behaviors. They'll say something that's a little over the line and watch to see if you react. They'll interrupt you and wait to see if you reclaim your space to speak. They gently push a boundary and they look to see if you'll hold the line. And the most crucial part is this. They don't need an immediate conclusion. They are simply gathering data, little by little, one reaction at a time. And every time you let it slide in silence, every time you give in unconditionally, every time you choose avoiding conflict over holding your ground, their mind isn't making an emotional judgment. It is simply recording a pattern of behavior. And from that, a very simple belief begins to form. This person's boundary can be pushed a little further. And once that belief takes root, they no longer need to test you from the beginning. Every action that follows is just a repetition of what you have already unintentionally allowed. People don't start out by disrespecting you. There is no single clear moment where they say to themselves, from now on, I will not respect this person. It doesn't happen as a single decision. It's more like a very slow process. They start by testing you with a small action, just to see how you'll react. If no boundary is set in return, they understand that this action is acceptable. Then they try it again, a little bit harder, a little bit further. And the important part isn't about them. It's about the fact that each and every time you didn't stop it. Not because you're weak, but because you choose to avoid conflict. You choose to keep the peace. You choose to just let it go. But in the human psyche, there's no such thing as letting something go harmlessly. Only two things are registered. A line exists, or no line exists. And when no boundary is clearly shown, that line is automatically pushed back, little by little, quietly, subtly, but surely, until you look back and realize that the thing you call being disrespected is actually just the result of all the times you didn't say, "Stop, there's a man. He isn't weak. He wasn't incapable. He wasn't any less smart than anyone else in the room, but he was always the one who got handed more work. Always the one they asked for a last-minute favor. Always the one who got cut off mid-sentence. No one ever said directly that he wasn't important, but the way they treated him, it always felt the same. He used to think it was because he was easygoing, because he didn't want to make things difficult for others. So he stayed quiet. He took on the extra work. He'd just smile when he was interrupted, until one day, in a completely ordinary moment, he realized the one thing that was hardest to accept. It wasn't that they looked down on him. It was that, in all of those moments, he had never once actually given them a reason to stop, not with anger, not with an argument, but with a clear boundary, one that he had never set. And this is something you need to understand. It isn't easy to hear, but it is what determines how other people will treat you. Respect is not earned by trying harder. It doesn't come from being more agreeable, and it doesn't come from pleasing more people. Quite the opposite. The harder you try to be accepted, the more you unintentionally lower your own value in their eyes, because in human psychology, the effort to be liked is often mistaken for being malleable, and someone who constantly changes for others is rarely seen as a person with firm boundaries. True respect doesn't come from doing more for people. It comes from knowing when to stop. Stop accepting behavior that makes you feel small. Stop ignoring it when your boundaries are crossed. Stop reacting in a way that teaches others they can walk all over you. And the very moment you stop allowing those things to happen, the way others see you begins to change. You don't need to learn clever comebacks. You don't need to find sharper words. You don't need to prepare the perfect response for every situation, because that is not the root of the problem. The real issue lies much deeper. You need to learn how to not react like someone who needs to be accepted, to not react like someone just trying to protect an image, to not react like someone who is afraid of losing approval. This is the root of it. When you enter an interaction with the need to be liked, you automatically start adjusting yourself. You automatically soften. You automatically pull back. You automatically lower your boundaries without even realizing it. And other people, they don't need to analyze it. They can just feel it. A hesitation in your voice, a slight shift in your eyes, an uncertainty in how you hold yourself. And they sense it instantly, not consciously, but with instinct. This person can be influenced. And from that moment on, the way they treat you begins to change. The phrase that changes this isn't meant to scare anyone. It doesn't have to be loud. It doesn't need to be cutting. And it doesn't need to be confrontational. What it does is something else entirely. It makes the other person realize that the way they have been treating you is no longer acceptable, not because you've changed in reaction to them, but because you have changed what you will permit. And that shift is communicated with one simple sentence. For example, "I'm not comfortable with that. It sounds so ordinary, so gentle, so unremarkable." But its very simplicity is what makes it so incredibly rare, because most people don't say this. They choose silence. They choose to endure. They choose keeping the peace over keeping their boundaries. And that is why a single, calm, and clear sentence like this, it's enough to create a profound shift in how others see you. This statement isn't complicated. It doesn't attack anyone. It doesn't cast blame. It doesn't try to prove you're right. And because of this, it doesn't put others on the defensive. It simply creates a very clear stop, a boundary that, until now, was unspoken. It doesn't explain why. It doesn't ask for understanding. And it doesn't seek agreement. It simply exists as a fact that you have established about yourself. And this is the most important part. In human psychology, something that requires no explanation is often treated as a settled fact. When you don't explain, there's nothing for them to argue against. When you don't ask for permission, they begin to understand that your boundaries don't require their approval. And when you don't attack but still hold your ground, the message becomes perfectly clear. You aren't reacting to them. You are defining your own boundaries. And from that moment on, the way they treat you is no longer based on old patterns. It's based on the new boundary you've just set. What makes others change how they treat you isn't about saying more. It's not that you have a better argument, and it's not that you've become more skilled at communication. It's a quiet shift that happens deep inside you. It's when you no longer place your entire worth on the approval of others. You no longer need them to understand you right away. You no longer need them to agree that you're right. And you no longer need them to respond in a way that makes you feel secure. When that need disappears, the way you show up in every interaction changes too. You stop speaking just to be accepted. You stop explaining just to be understood. You stop changing yourself just to keep the peace. And it is this very lack of needing approval that creates a kind of stability that is hard to shake. In the eyes of others, they don't need to analyze this. They can just feel it. A person who is no longer easily led. A person whose boundaries are no longer easily crossed. A person who no longer reacts out of a fear of being judged. And when that happens, you don't need to say another word. Your presence alone is enough to change how other people adjust their behavior. Because when you don't need their approval, you are no longer in a position to be controlled by their reactions. Change doesn't happen just because you understand the problem. What truly matters is how you begin to act differently in the smallest of moments. And here are the simple principles that can instantly change the way others see you. Rule 1. Stop the people-pleasing reflex. When someone makes a request, the natural reaction for many of us is to answer immediately, to agree on the spot, or to find some way to make them happy instantly. But that quick reaction is exactly how you lose your boundaries without even realizing it. Instead, give yourself a moment of pause, even if it's just for a few seconds. Because in the psychology of communication, a pause isn't a sign of slowness. It is a sign of control. It shows the other person that you are not driven by the pressure of the moment. And sometimes, just that small pause is enough to change the entire way they approach you. Model. Principle 2. Stop over-explaining. You do not have to explain every decision you make. You don't need to create a list of reasons just to get someone's approval. And you certainly don't need to turn your answer into a long-winded defense. Think of those common lines. Because I'm busy. Because I'm tired. Because I have something else to do. They might sound polite, but to the person who hears them, it unintentionally sends a different signal. That you are seeking their acceptance. That you need them to understand. That you need to be forgiven for your own choice. The more you explain, the more you put yourself in a position of asking for permission, when in reality, a short, clear statement that simply ends there shows far greater inner strength. Principle 3. Maintain a steady state. What makes your boundaries truly clear isn't just about the words you use. It's about the state you hold while you speak. No defensiveness, no rushing to prove yourself, no reacting with excessive emotion, no mindless apologies when you've done nothing wrong, no forced smiles to ease the tension, no changing your tone just to avoid discomfort. Instead, you simply hold a very simple state, calm, clear, and stable, because in human interaction, a steady presence is felt more powerfully than words. People don't just hear what you say, they feel how grounded you are in what you say, and that is what creates the real shift in how they treat you. At first, when you start to change how you react, people won't immediately understand what's happening. You'll feel a very clear difference, not from one specific person, but in how your entire environment begins to recalibrate around you. Some people will be surprised, some will test you to see if you're serious, and others might react with a little irritation. It's not because you did anything wrong, it's because you no longer react the way you used to. You no longer just let things slide. You no longer just laugh it off like before, and you're no longer easily pulled into those old roles. For them, this means losing the familiar version of you, the version they were used to interacting with. And when a person changes how they allow others to treat them, the people around them will always need time to adjust. But here is the most important part. That initial discomfort is not a sign that you're doing something wrong. It's a sign that you are breaking free from an old version of yourself, a version that was easily pushed around, that gave in too quickly, and that let its own boundaries be ignored. And when you refuse to go back to being that person, everything around you begins to adjust to the new standard you are setting. Listen, you don't have to become a cold person. You don't need to act distant, and you don't need to make yourself unapproachable just to be respected. What you truly need is not a new outer shell, but a clearer sense of your own self. You just need to become someone who knows their own worth, who knows what is acceptable and what crosses a line. And when that becomes clear within you, the way you carry yourself on the outside changes naturally. You no longer have to strain for recognition. You no longer need to fight to be treated better. And you no longer feel the need to prove yourself in every situation. Because when you truly understand your own value, you stop searching for it in the eyes of others. And in that moment, your worth no longer depends on validation from anyone else. It's simply something you carry with you, whether others recognize it or not. Stoicism doesn't teach you how to win against others. It doesn't teach you how to win arguments. And it doesn't help you dominate every situation. What it truly offers is a deeper change inside of you. It's when you no longer react to how people treat you as a measure of your own value. You no longer get a high when they respect you, and you no longer crash when they look down on you. Because your worth is no longer tied to the unpredictable whims of the outside world. It's anchored within, in the way you understand yourself. And when that happens, you are no longer easily pulled into other people's emotional games. You're no longer easily shaped by their attitudes. And you no longer lose your stability just because of one negative reaction. And in that state of being, something very natural will emerge. Respect. You don't have to demand it. You don't have to prove anything for it. And you don't have to chase after it. It appears as a natural consequence of you no longer depending on it. If you have ever been looked down on, been overshadowed, or felt like you weren't truly being heard, take a moment and comment, I understand. It's not about answering to anyone else. It's about confirming to yourself that you've started to re-examine how you allow people to treat you. And if you want to build a stronger mindset each day, a way of thinking that is calmer, clearer, and less affected by the world around you, subscribe to Stoic Code. Because here, we don't try to change the world outside. We learn how to change our own place within it.